Well, I think one of the biggest challenges with this proliferation of devices comes a proliferation of ad tech to service those devices. So in the past, these were kind of singular unified ad systems, but now with the growth of digital, growth of programmatic, there's a number of new channels and new formats, new platforms that need to be serviced. And as a result, the ad stack sitting behind most of the media owners that we work with is just as diverse as the devices that they're servicing. So it creates real challenges when it comes to unifying workflow and garnering efficiencies when you have to pivot between a number of different systems and technology, a lot of which doesn't talk to each other.
Can you drill down into that a little bit more? Because it seems like it shouldn't be that difficult, but why is streamlining the workflow in particular a challenge?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to this need for converged selling. If you look at any large media property these days, they might have a big linear business on the television core traditional television side, and they might have streaming audio or radio as well as streaming video. Those legacy systems on the linear side didn't port over to digital very well. So inherently, the media companies need to build out their digital ad stack. And those legacy systems don't talk to digital. So if you have, two separate systems that don't talk to one another, you basically have to have two separate workflows. So a lot of the challenge is driving interoperability within those systems so that the workflow can not only be interoperable, but unified.
So interoperable is a buzzword, and it's been sort of talked about from the perspective of data collection and clean rooms, and as well as even in sort of the transition to multiple currencies. What does interoperability mean from an operative standpoint?
Well, I think it means, two having disparate systems being able to send data bidirectionally. Pulling data out of a system is relatively easy, but when you have to push data back in, it can be somewhat challenging, especially, as I mentioned before, with a lot of the linear systems, they operate linearly, where the data kind of flows from the beginning of the workflow to the end of the workflow. Digital is inherently two-way. There are ad calls that come back, and there's also data coming back. So I look at it as integrating two systems with bidirectional data would be kind of the technical way of looking at interoperability. But ultimately, it's about two systems kind of operating as one.
So I'll go to one more buzzword for you, and that's outcomes. We've talked a lot about the media sales side, but on the buy side, there seems to be a big shift in terms of wanting to buy and transact and measure based on outcomes. How can media owners kind of be prepared to make that transition?
I think they already are. I think a lot of it has to do with kind of migrating to more census-based data. The current measurement system, the currency with Nielsen is based on a sample, and it's kind of hard to really measure outcomes at an individual level when working with sampled data. So there's been a lot of work on that front, 605 and iSpot and VideoAmp, all of which have onboarded massive amounts of data and data that's matchable. So on the front end, being able to match against more advanced audiences, and then on the back end, being able to match impression data with sales data. And I think the onboarding of that data is kind of the first part, but then the challenge is how do you integrate that data in at scale through multiple points in the workflow? So as I mentioned before, it's really valuable on the front end as planners are planning, whether that's on the buy side or the sell side. And then on the back end with attribution, you need that same data in order to run attribution. Systems weren't necessarily designed to handle that massive amount of data. They were designed to pull a rating point, which is a small fraction of the data that's required to run attribution. And that's where AOS and Operative come into the mix, just because our system's designed to support scaled data like that. And I think as multi-currency becomes a thing, AOS will be a really important part of the mix.
Last question for you. We're headed into the upfronts. Anything interesting or surprising that you think is gonna come out of this season?
Well, I think it kind of touches on what we spoke about earlier on multi-currency. I think that's definitely going to be much more pervasive this year, whether it's as a supplement to kind of the core currency, or whether it's part of a buy based on attribution. I think the prevalence of that is going to be much more noted this in this upfront, and I'm anxious to see, what percentage of the dollars spent are going to be based on kind of the existing currency versus some of the alternative currencies. So we'll see.